Welcome to In All Things. Here at Loyola University Chicago, we call ourselves a diverse community seeking God in all things. Join us for a series of thought-provoking and engaging conversations with ramblers across many areas of expertise. We hope you can join us in a process of discovery and inspiration as we all expand our perspectives. I'd now like to introduce our host, our Vice President for Mission Integration, Claire Noonan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome again to In All Things. I am delighted to introduce you to today's guest, Barry Sullivan. Professor Sullivan joined the faculty of Loyola University Chicago School of Law in 2009 as the inaugural holder of the Cooney and Conway Chair in Advocacy after an already distinguished and decorated career, including service as an assistant to the Solicitor General of the United States, litigation of cases in many state and federal courts, including the Supreme Court of the United States. Among his notable cases is People v. Wilson, in which the Illinois Supreme Court reversed a death penalty conviction based on police torture in Area 2 of the Chicago Police Department. He was the founding chair of the American Bar Association's Coordinating Committee on AIDS and served on the Executive Board and Advocacy Council of the ABA Center for Human Rights, and was 5 years as Dean of the School of Law at Washington and Lee University. Barry was recently installed as the Raymond and Mary Simon Chair in Constitutional Law and George Anastaplo Professor of Constitutional Law and History here at Loyola. I was honored to have been invited to that installation ceremony and to hear his paper on presidential immunity delivered to a mesmerized crowd in the Power Rogers and Smith ceremonial courtroom here in Corboy Hall. Barry, congratulations on your new appointment and welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So in addition to this distinguished legal career, Barry, I also know you to be a person of faith. And in fact, we first met through your work as a life trustee of the Catholic Theological Union, which is my doctoral alma mater. As you know, the premise of this show is to affirm our conviction as a Jesuit and Catholic university that the expansion of knowledge and pursuit of truth is sacred and holy, that we are a diverse community seeking God in all things. So I'd like to begin our conversation there and perhaps ask you if you understand your legal career and your scholarship in the law as an expression of your faith.
Yes, I think I do. I think that my faith and my interest in law really go hand in hand and have since a very early age. I grew up in a small town in New England, and I was fortunate to be educated by an extraordinary order of sisters, Les Sœurs de l'Institut Jeanne d'Arc, which was a Canadian order founded in the early 20th century by a very charismatic woman who I knew as a child. The order was headquartered in Ottawa, and it was a very ecumenically oriented order long before the Vatican Council, and was very interested in social justice. And I think that from a very early age, I was influenced by those sisters, and my interests continued when I was in secondary school. I went to a small boarding school. The chaplain there was an Episcopal priest, and this was in the early 60s. And there was a required course in religion sophomore year. And I think that in that course, I read Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail when it was still hot off the press. Actually not on the press yet. It was a mimeographed handout that we had in that religion course. And the religion course was really a course about civil rights and human rights.
Yeah. So right away, that chaplain and teacher, even in your grade school and secondary school, made that connection between advocacy for civil rights, the fight for civil rights and human rights, and as an expression of a worldview based in an understanding of who God is and what God's desires for our world are.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And how have you then kind of taken that charge upon yourself? I mean, you've both been advocates for people who are themselves part of a civil rights struggle, but in a way, you are that yourself.
Well, I've always, I think, thought that it was important to do something with your faith, and when I was in practice, I always had at least one pro bono case every at a time, and I did many Supreme Court briefs for groups like MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and I always had individual clients as well. When I had the opportunity to chair the ABA Coordinating Committee on AIDS, it was one of the most profound experiences of my life. And we were asked to make recommendations about every area of the law affected by HIV, from the criminal justice system to immigration and insurance. There were something like 20 areas of the law we were asked to make recommendations as to what sound legal policy would be. In that connection, we had hearings all over the country, and it was very moving to see people who were struggling with HIV testify before the commission, and we would learn later that some of them had died shortly after they had testified. Members of the commission also died while we were at work.
Wow. So can you give an example maybe in that period, Barry, where the personal testimony of people experiencing the ravages of AIDS, especially it sounds like it at that moment where it was a new phenomenon and folks were even maybe still trying to understand what was going on, and how their narratives influenced where you would move with your recommendation in terms of the law and the way the law needed to change and evolve to deal with this new phenomenon.
For sure. Witnesses, for example, would testify about their experiences in court. And at that time, it was not unusual for judges to have their bailiffs, their court personnel, put on hazmat suits if someone with HIV was in the courtroom. And there was absolutely no rational reason for that. And people who had been subjected to that would testify. People who had experienced discrimination in the medical setting, for example. And certainly each person who testified before the commission who was a person with HIV moved us a great deal.
that illustrates so beautifully one of the descriptions of you that your colleagues at Washington and Lee made as they threw a party when you stepped down from the deanship. And one of your colleagues said, his professionalism and sense of integrity are related deep down. They come from the same well, and I think the common source is vocation. He knows that his life is not his own. Can you talk a little bit, Barry, about the practice of law and maybe your teaching and scholarship as well as a vocation?
Well, I had a law school professor, very famous constitutional law professor, Philip Kurland, who jokingly said that law is the only vocation that people aren't called to, they just sort of fall into. And I think that that whether you have a vocation or not, starting out, that most lawyers end up feeling that they have a vocation for what they do. At least I like to think that. And I think it may have been more true in the past than perhaps it is today. But certainly one has a sense, I think, that one practices law not for oneself, but for one's clients and hopefully for the common good. The preamble to the ABA rules of professional responsibility talk about the lawyer as having a special responsibility for justice. And I think that lawyers who do feel that they have a vocation think of it as a vocation for justice.
And you obviously do.
Well, I've been very fortunate in working in places that have allowed me to pursue justice. I was drawn to my former law firm largely because of its reputation for doing pro bono work and being willing to take on unpopular causes, which when I joined the firm was, I think, much rarer than it is today.
Tell me about a cause that you were able to take up that was unpopular, and why were you willing to step up to the risk of that?
Well, I think probably the most unpopular case or the most unpopular client I had was a young black man who had been convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of 2 Chicago police officers. And I remember the day that I argued that case in the Illinois Supreme Court and walking out of court, that was, the courtroom was filled with police officers and wives of police officers. And they looked at me as if I were the worst possible criminal you could imagine. I've never received such dirty looks as I've left a courtroom. But I was asked to take on the case because the state appellate defender had a conflict of interest. There were 2 brothers who had both been convicted. The other brother had not been sentenced to death, but they had both been convicted, and the state appellate defender opted to represent the other brother, and the trial judge allowed the state appellate defender to get out of the case only if he could find a reputable lawyer to represent the other brother. And so I agreed to represent Andrew Wilson. And clearly the crimes that he was accused of and convicted of were horrendous crimes. But as I got into the case, I found that he had been mistreated in virtually every way that it's possible to mistreat somebody in the legal system. He had been tortured by the Chicago police, and there were photographs, thankfully, to show the injuries that he sustained at the hands of the Chicago police. The judge had given the state twice as many peremptory challenges as the defendants had, which allowed the state to systematically remove people of color from the jury. There was eyewitness identification evidence that was induced by hypnosis, which was an issue of first impression in the Illinois court system. And we succeeded in having his conviction reversed.
As you made a move out of full-time practice into legal education, Barry, did you take with you the idea of preparing your students for that kind of commitment to justice, to courage in taking up an unpopular cause?
I hope so. Certainly, it's been my intention to be a model for my students. Whether I've succeeded or not, I'd have to ask them, I guess.
Well, I think your duration in the field is some testimony to that, although I might take you up on that idea of interviewing your students as well. This is a little bit related of a question, but you've written in a profile I read that Loyola published about you that listening to students, taking them seriously, trying to make them think about the reasons why the law is the way it is and the importance of civility in the practice of law. I think the idea of civility right now in this polarized political climate we're in is sort of loaded, and I wonder if you could speak a bit about whether you maintain, or if you do, why you maintain the importance of civility even as you continue in your vocation of taking on the role of advocate for people who have been victims of gross violations of their civil or human rights.
I think that civility, in my first year at Washington Lee, in the talk that I gave to the first year students when they came in, I said something like, incivility is like sand in the gears of justice. Mm. And I really believe that. Civility is what allows the system of justice to function properly. Lawyers who are uncivil to each other are an impediment to the functioning of the system. I once argued a case in the Seventh Circuit against a very distinguished older lawyer. And at the end of the argument, the judges said to us, which was quite remarkable, the only time this has ever happened to me, but one of the judges said, if all lawyers acted with the civility toward each other that you do, we wouldn't need a commission on civility. And I took that as a great compliment. Certainly, my opponent was a very distinguished lawyer, and it wasn't hard to be civil toward him. Yeah. But I thought that was a great compliment.
It is a great compliment. So we're coming up. I always say this, but it's hard to believe so quickly. But we're coming up on the end of our time, Barry. So I like to close these interviews with this question. And it begins with a quotation by Howard Gray, who is a now deceased but revered teacher of Ignatian spirituality. And he said in an article called Soul Education that, simply put, the Ignatian instinct is to help people become fully alive. You've already given so many beautiful examples in these short few minutes of moments of, at least where I would say, a person who is fully alive, being fully alive. But I wonder, as we close our conversation, are you experiencing fullness of life in any way right now that we didn't get a chance to talk about that you'd like to share?
This semester, I'm teaching a class that I've taught once before called The Search for Social Justice in the Long 1960s. And it's a course in legal history, the legal history of the civil rights movement. And I have 16 students. It's a seminar course. And it allows me to teach the students about things that they've only glancingly heard about. It's really quite interesting. As I say, this is the second time I've done it. It's quite interesting to see the gaps in students' knowledge, even though they've had courses in undergraduate or in high school that touched on the civil rights movement. For example, students each year find it amazing that it wasn't all the Supreme Court's doing, that the Supreme Court, after Brown against the Board of Education, did very little for the next 10 years and left it up to the lower federal courts to sort out whether Brown was going to be limited solely to education, whether the anti-subordination principle would be applied to other areas of life. And I was fortunate enough in my first job out of law school to be a law clerk on the Fifth Circuit in New Orleans for one of the great judges of the civil rights period, who was responsible for such things as the desegregation of the schools all over the South, the admission of James Meredith to the University of Mississippi, and so on. And one of the finest human beings I've ever known. And there was a group of 4 judges on the Court of Appeals who were derogatorily referred to as the 4 by another judge who was a segregationist. And this course has given me an opportunity to share my knowledge of that period, of those judges, all of whom I knew. And it really is something that brings me alive.
Well, and I'm sure it brings out the best in your students as well to learn this history and to imagine the role that they'll play in this next chapter of American history and of the continued fight for the fullness of civil rights and human rights for all of our citizens. Thank you so much, Barry, for this conversation. I feel so honored to have had this chance to listen to your story and to expand maybe the worldview of our listeners a little bit through your reflections with us. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I want to remind our listeners that you can find more episodes of In All Things on Spotify, YouTube, and the Loyola University Chicago website by searching for Ignatian Heritage Month. My thanks to the whole team at In All Things, including Kayla Cooney, Clemisha Richards, Lauren Schwer, and Julia Price. Until next time, everyone, keep seeking God in all things.